The message arrived at dawn, and Vincent Cole knew immediately that something was wrong. He had been the human ambassador to the Galactic Council for 3 years now, and he had never received a summons like this before. The words were cold and direct, and they left no room for discussion or delay. He was to appear before the full council assembly within 6 hours, and failure to attend would be considered an act of defiance against the entire galactic community. Vincent dressed quickly in his formal diplomatic uniform and made his way to the transport station. The journey to Axis Prime took only 30 minutes through the quantum gate network, but those 30 minutes felt like hours. He tried to think of what could have prompted such an urgent summons, but nothing came to mind. Humanity had been peaceful in their expansion, and they had followed every council regulation to the letter. They had paid their dues and participated in joint scientific endeavors, and they had even sent medical aid to 3 different species. During recent natural disasters, when Vincent arrived at the massive council station, he noticed something unusual. The normally busy corridors were nearly empty, and the few aliens he did see quickly looked away when he passed. Security was tighter than normal, with armed guards posted at every intersection and checkpoint. The atmosphere felt heavy with tension and anticipation, and Vincent felt his stomach tighten with worry. The council chambers were located at the heart of the station, and as Vincent entered, he was struck by the sight before him. All 47 species were represented today, and their ambassadors filled the circular room in tiers that rose toward the domed ceiling above. At the center of it all sat Speaker Tharn on his elevated platform. The insectoid being was over 300 years old, and he had led the council for most of that time. His compound eyes reflected the light in strange patterns, and his mandibles clicked softly as Vincent approached. Vincent took his position at the human delegation stand and waited. The silence in the chamber was oppressive, and he could feel thousands of alien eyes watching him. Finally, Speaker Tharn rose to his full imposing height and began to speak. His voice was amplified through the chamber's audio system, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The council had made a decision regarding humanity and their rapid military expansion. Over the past 20 years since joining the galactic community, humans had built a fleet of warships that rivaled species who had been spacefaring for millennia. They had colonized 63 worlds and established mining operations in over 200 asteroid belts. Their population was growing at an unprecedented rate, and their industrial capacity was expanding faster than any species in recorded history. This concerned the council greatly. Several member species had voiced fears about human intentions and motivations. Why did humanity need so many warships if they claimed to be peaceful? Why were they expanding so aggressively into unclaimed territories? What were their true long-term goals in the galaxy? Therefore, the council had reached a unanimous decision. Humanity must reduce their military fleet by 70% immediately. All warships except for basic defense vessels must be decommissioned within 90 days. Human expansion into new territories would be frozen for a period of no less than 50 years. And humanity would submit to regular inspections by council military observers to ensure compliance with these new restrictions. Vincent felt the blood drain from his face as he listened. This was not a negotiation or a discussion. This was an ultimatum. The council was demanding that humanity essentially disarm themselves and halt their growth as a civilization. He raised his hand to speak, but Speaker Tharn was not finished. If humanity refused to comply, there would be consequences. Economic sanctions would be imposed immediately, cutting off human access to council trade networks and technology exchanges. Human ships would be denied access to neutral space stations and quantum gate systems. And if humanity continued to resist, the council would have no choice but to consider military intervention to enforce their decision. The chamber fell silent again, and Speaker Tharn gestured for Vincent to respond. Every eye in the room focused on the human ambassador, waiting to see what he would say. Vincent took a deep breath and stepped forward. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath his words. He thanked the council for their time and consideration, but he had to respectfully decline their demands. Humanity had violated no laws and broken no treaties. They had expanded into unclaimed space that belonged to no one. Their military existed solely for self-defense, and they had never threatened or attacked any council species. To demand that they disarm and cease their natural growth as a civilization was unreasonable and unacceptable. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Dozens of council members began shouting at once in a cacophony of alien languages. Some demanded that Vincent be removed from the chamber for his insolence. Others called for immediate sanctions to begin. A few of the more militant species suggested that humanity had just declared war on the entire council. Speaker Tharn raised his clawed appendages for silence, and gradually the chamber quieted. His mandibles clicked rapidly, and what Vincent had learned was a sign of extreme agitation. The speaker declared that humanity had 1 week to reconsider their position, 7 days to comply with the council's demands. If at the end of that time humanity had not begun decommissioning their fleet, the consequences would begin. Vincent bowed formally and left the chamber. His hands were shaking, but he kept his expression neutral until he was safely away from prying eyes. Once he reached his private communication room on the station, he immediately opened a secure channel to Earth. Admiral Lisa Grant appeared on the screen within seconds. She was the commander of Earth's Third Fleet and one of the highest-ranking military officers in the human Space Force. Vincent quickly explained what had happened, and Lisa's expression grew darker with each word. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was hard and angry when she finally responded. The Council had no right to make such demands, and humanity would never submit to such blatant intimidation. She would recommend to the government that they refuse completely and prepare for whatever came next. But they needed to send a message, Vincent said, something that would make the Council understand that humanity was not some weak species that could be bullied into submission. They needed to show strength without firing a single shot. They needed to make the Council afraid. Lisa smiled grimly and nodded. She knew exactly what to do. There was a ship that had just completed its final trials and been approved for active service. The Defiant was humanity's newest and most advanced warship, and it carried technology that would make the Council's entire military look primitive by comparison. She would send Captain Daniel Shaw and his crew to Axis Prime. They would show the Council what they were really dealing with. Vincent ended the call and sat back in his chair. The next week would determine the future of humanity in the galaxy. Either the Council would back down or they would go to war. He hoped it would not come to that, but he knew his species well enough to know that they would never surrender their freedom. Across the station, alien ambassadors were already sending urgent messages to their home worlds. Humanity had refused the Council's demands. War might be coming, and none of them truly understood what that would mean. Captain Daniel Shaw stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched his crew prepare for departure. The ship was a marvel of human engineering, and it represented everything that made humanity dangerous in the eyes of the Council. At 400 meters long, it was not the largest warship humans had built, but it was by far the most advanced. The hull was composed of adaptive armor that could harden or flex in response to incoming fire, and the weapon systems included railguns and missile batteries that could devastate targets at incredible range. But the real secret was the jump drive, and that was what would change everything. Lieutenant Kate Morrison sat at the navigation console running final checks on the drive systems. She was young for her rank, but she had graduated top of her class at the academy, and she understood the jump drive better than almost anyone else in the fleet. The technology was revolutionary because it did not simply move a ship faster than light like conventional warp drives. Instead, it created a temporary tear in the fabric of space itself, allowing the ship to essentially step from one location to another instantaneously. The energy requirements were enormous, and the calculations needed to be perfect, or the ship could end up thousands of light years off course or worse. But when it worked, it made the Defiant the fastest ship in known space. Commander Ryan Baker approached Daniel with a datapad in hand. He was the first officer, and he had been with Daniel for 5 years across 2 different ship assignments. Ryan was cautious by nature, and he always wanted to make sure every detail was perfect before any major operation. He showed Daniel the final systems report, and everything was green across the board. Weapons were at full capacity, and the reactor was operating at 102% efficiency. The jump drive had been tested and retested, and Chief Engineer Paula Stevens had personally signed off on its readiness. Daniel nodded and dismissed Ryan to his station. He then opened a communication channel to Admiral Lisa Grant, who was monitoring the departure from Earth. She appeared on the main screen, and her expression was serious. She reminded Daniel that his mission was not to start a war, but to prevent one. He was to take the Defiant to Axis Prime and demonstrate humanity's capabilities without firing a shot if possible. The Council needed to see that humans were not weak and that threatening them was a mistake. But they also needed to see that humans were not mindlessly aggressive. Strength and restraint in equal measure. Daniel acknowledged the orders and ended the transmission. He turned to Kate and told her to plot a course to Axis Prime. But he wanted her to take them through the territories of the species who had been most vocal about demanding human disarmament. The Vren hierarchy and the Talaxar Union had both given speeches at the Council about how dangerous humanity was and how they needed to be contained. Daniel wanted those species to see the Defiant pass through their space and understand what they were really dealing with. Kate smiled slightly as she input the coordinates. The route she plotted would take them directly through the heart of Vren space and then along the edge of Talaxar territory before reaching Axis Prime. Under normal circumstances, such a journey would take nearly 3 weeks using conventional warp drives, but with the jump drive, they would make the trip in less than 4 days. The Defiant left Earth orbit and accelerated away from the inner solar system. Once they were clear of the gravity wells of the planets, Kate engaged the jump drive for the first time. The effect was stunning even for those who had seen it before. Space seemed to twist and fold around the ship, and for a brief moment reality itself appeared to ripple like water. Then there was a flash of light and the Defiant was gone. It reappeared 16 light-years away in the blink of an eye. The crew cheered at the successful jump and Daniel allowed himself a small smile. They were on their way and the galaxy was about to learn what human technology could do. 2 days into the journey, they entered Vren space. The Vren were a proud warrior species who had built their civilization on military strength and conquest. They had one of the largest fleets in the Council, and they had been among the loudest voices demanding that humanity disarm. Daniel expected them to send ships to intercept and question the Defiant, and he was not disappointed. 3 Vren patrol cruisers detected the Defiant's energy signature and moved to intercept. They broadcast a challenge demanding that the human ship identify itself and explain its presence in Vren territory. Kate looked at Daniel with raised eyebrows and he nodded. She engaged the jump drive again and the Defiant vanished before the Vren ships could close the distance. The human warship reappeared 2 light-years away, having covered the distance in seconds. The Vren ships were left behind, still searching for a target that was no longer there. The same scenario played out 6 more times as they crossed through Vren space. Each time patrol ships detected them and moved to intercept, and each time the Defiant simply jumped away before contact could be made. Daniel knew that every one of those encounters was being reported up the Vren chain of command. By now, their military leaders would be studying the sensor data and trying to understand how a human ship could move so impossibly fast. When they reached the border of Talaxar space, Daniel decided to make an even bolder statement. The Talaxar were less militaristic than the Vren, but they were master strategists and they controlled some of the most important trade routes in the galaxy. Their economy was built on carefully maintained control of shipping lanes, and they did not appreciate unexpected visitors. Intelligence reports indicated that they had positioned a large fleet in the region, specifically to monitor human ship movements. Kate's sensors detected the Talaxar blockade ahead. 30 warships arranged in a defensive formation across a 2 light-year span. It was an impressive display of force meant to demonstrate Talaxar power and control. Daniel studied the formation and then told Kate to plot a jump that would take them right through the center of the blockade. Ryan protested, saying that such a maneuver was unnecessarily provocative, but Daniel overruled him. The whole point of this journey was to be provocative. They needed to show these species that human ships could go wherever they wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Kate calculated the jump and executed it perfectly. The Defiant appeared in the exact center of the Talaxar formation, traveling at high speed. The jump wake spread outward in all directions as the ship emerged from its spatial tear. The exotic energy of the wake hit the Talaxar ships like an electromagnetic hammer. Sensor systems overloaded and navigation computers crashed. Communications were disrupted across the entire formation. For a brief chaotic moment, 30 Talaxar warships were completely blind and helpless. The Defiant accelerated away and jumped again before the Talaxar could recover. By the time their systems came back online, the human ship was long gone, leaving only confused and frightened officers trying to explain to their superiors what had just happened. Chief Engineer Paula Stevens came to the bridge to check on the jump drive after that maneuver. She was a veteran of 20 years in the engineering corps, and she knew the systems of the Defiant better than anyone. She reported that the drive had performed flawlessly, and they still had plenty of power reserves for multiple jumps. Daniel thanked her and told her to keep the drive ready. They would need it again soon. As they approached Axis Prime, Daniel received a message from Ambassador Vincent Cole. The situation at the Council was deteriorating rapidly. Multiple species were demanding military action against humanity for what they were calling aggressive provocations. The Vren and Talaxar ambassadors were particularly vocal, and they were calling for a combined Council fleet to intercept and disable the Defiant before it reached the station. Speaker Tharn was trying to maintain order, but the Council was fracturing along old alliance lines. Daniel read the message and deleted it. There was nothing he could do about Council politics. His job was to bring the Defiant to Axis Prime and show them what human technology could do. Everything else was beyond his control. The ship jumped into the Axis Prime system 3 days and 18 hours after leaving Earth. They had crossed a distance that would have taken conventional ships nearly a month. As they took up position 1 million kilometers from the Council station, every sensor in the system locked onto them. Daniel sat in his command chair and waited. The Council had threatened humanity and demanded their submission. Now they would see what humanity thought of threats. The Defiant held its position in the darkness of space, and every species in the Council watched with growing unease. The human warship was unlike anything most of them had seen before. Its lines were sharp and aggressive, and even at rest it looked dangerous. The energy readings coming from the ship were far higher than should be possible for a vessel of its size. Whatever power source the humans were, using it was clearly more advanced than standard. Council fusion reactors. Admiral Cross stood in the command center of the Council Defense Forces and studied the tactical display. He was a Krell, which meant he stood nearly 3 meters tall and had 4 powerful arms that ended in clawed hands. His species had been warriors for thousands of years, and he had personally commanded fleets in 6 different conflicts. He was not easily impressed or intimidated, but something about the human ship bothered him. It had crossed through Vren and Talaxar space with impunity, and it had arrived at Axis Prime days ahead of when it should have been possible. The reports he had received about the ship's speed were difficult to believe. The Admiral opened a channel to the Defiant and demanded that they power down their weapons and submit to inspection. This was standard procedure for any military vessel entering Council space, and he expected compliance. But the response he received was polite and firm. Captain Daniel Shaw thanked the Admiral for his concern but declined to power down. The Defiant was in international space and was operating within all legal parameters. They would remain at their current position and await further instructions from Ambassador Vincent Cole. Admiral Cross felt his temper rising. No one refused a direct order from the Council Defense Forces. He terminated the communication and began issuing orders to his fleet. Within an hour, he had assembled over 200 warships around Axis Prime, cruisers and destroyers and battleships from a dozen different species, all converging on the station. It was the largest fleet concentration in Council history, and the message was clear: comply or be destroyed. On the station, Ambassador Vincent Cole was meeting with Senator Maria Ortega, who had just arrived from Earth. Maria was a senior member of the human government, and she had been given full authority to negotiate on behalf of humanity. She was in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had been a diplomat for 40 years, and she had seen every kind of political game and power play imaginable. Maria listened as Vincent explained the current situation. The Council was preparing for military action, and several species were calling for the immediate destruction of the Defiant. Speaker Tharn was losing control of the assembly, and the hardliners were gaining more influence by the hour. If something did not change soon, there would be a shooting war. Maria nodded slowly and asked Vincent a simple question. Did he believe the Council would actually attack humanity? Vincent hesitated before answering. A week ago, he would have said no. The Council prided itself on being civilized and using diplomacy to solve disputes, but now, after seeing the fear and anger in the chamber, he was not so sure. The Council was afraid, and fear made people do stupid things. Maria stood and smoothed her formal robes. Then they needed to address that fear directly. She would speak to the full Council and make humanity's position absolutely clear. They would not back down, and they would not submit to threats. But they were also not seeking war. The choice was entirely up to the Council. The emergency session was called, and Maria stood before the assembled representatives. She spoke in clear, simple terms without diplomatic flourishes or careful language. Humanity had committed no crimes and violated no laws. They had built their fleet for defense, and they had expanded into empty space that belonged to no species. The Council's demands were unreasonable and would not be met. However, humanity had no desire for conflict. They proposed a simple solution: treat humanity as equals and negotiate in good faith. Respect their sovereignty and their right to defend themselves. In return, humanity would work with the Council on mutual security concerns and share some of their technological advances over time. Several Council members shouted objections, but Maria continued speaking. She reminded them that humanity had contributions to make to the galactic community. Human medical technology had already saved thousands of alien lives. Human agricultural methods were being studied by 6 different species to improve their food production. Human fusion reactors were more efficient than anything the Council had developed. Working together would benefit everyone. Fighting would benefit no one. Speaker Tharn rose and his mandibles clicked rapidly. He declared that the Council had already made its decision, and humanity must comply. The military buildup was a threat that could not be ignored. If humanity refused to disarm, then the Council had no choice but to enforce their demands by force. Maria looked directly at the speaker and asked him if he was truly prepared to go to war over this. Was he ready to order his fleets to attack human ships and colonies? Was he prepared for the casualties and destruction that would result? Because humanity would not surrender quietly. They would fight, and they would make any aggressor pay dearly for their victory. Before Tharn could respond, Admiral Cross's voice boomed through the chamber's speakers. His fleet was in position surrounding the Defiant. He was giving the human ship one final warning. Power down weapons and engines and prepare to be boarded for inspection. Failure to comply would be met with immediate military action. The Admiral was confident in his position. No single ship could stand against 200 warships. The humans had no choice but to surrender. On the bridge of the Defiant, Daniel sat calmly in his command chair. Lieutenant Jason Webb at the tactical station was tracking all 200 Council ships. They had formed a perfect sphere around the Defiant with weapons charged and locked on. It was an impressive show of force. Daniel asked Kate if the jump drive was ready, and she confirmed that it was at full power. Daniel opened a channel to the entire bridge crew. What they were about to do had never been attempted before, and there were risks involved. But the orders were clear. Show the Council what human technology could do. Make them understand that threatening humanity was a mistake. He told his crew that he was proud to serve with them and that he trusted them completely. Then he gave the order. Kate's hands moved across her console with practiced precision. The jump drive engaged, but instead of moving the ship to a different location, it activated while the Defiant remained stationary. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the surrounding Council fleet. Space itself seemed to tear open around the human warship, and exotic energy poured out in all directions. The jump wake expanded in a perfect sphere, moving at the speed of light. When the wake hit the Council ships, their systems failed instantly. Sensors overloaded and went dark. Navigation computers crashed and rebooted uselessly. Communication arrays burned out from the electromagnetic pulse. Power fluctuated wildly as the exotic energy interfered with their fusion reactors. Within seconds, 200 warships were rendered completely blind and helpless. They drifted in space, unable to see or communicate or even maneuver. Their crews sat in darkness, emergency lights flickering as they tried desperately to restore basic functions. The Defiant sat untouched at the center of the chaos. Its systems were specifically shielded against jump wake effects, and the ship remained fully operational. Daniel watched the tactical display as one by one the Council ships disappeared from sensors. They were still there physically, but they might as well have ceased to exist. He felt no satisfaction in what had just happened. This was not a victory. It was a demonstration, a warning. Admiral Cross's flagship was among the hardest hit. The mighty Krell warrior sat in the dark, unable to contact his fleet or issue orders. For the first time in his long military career, he felt truly helpless, and he understood with chilling clarity what had just happened. The human ship had disabled his entire fleet without firing a single weapon. If they had wanted to destroy the Council ships, they could have done so easily while the fleet was blind and helpless. But they had chosen not to. They had shown mercy. On Axis Prime, the Council chambers erupted into chaos. Species who had been demanding military action now called for immediate peace negotiations. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A few of the more militant representatives still insisted that this was proof humanity needed to be stopped, but their voices were drowned out by calls for restraint and diplomacy. Counselor Vex, who had been quietly building support for a peaceful solution, stood and demanded order. He pointed out what should be obvious to everyone. Humanity had just demonstrated that they could disable the entire Council defense forces in seconds. They had done so without destroying a single ship or killing a single being. This showed both tremendous capability and tremendous restraint. Perhaps it was time to reconsider the Council's position. An elderly counselor named Dreth rose slowly to speak. He represented one of the founding species of the Council, and his words carried great weight. He admitted that the Council had made a grave error in judgment. They had assumed humanity was weak because they were young. They had tried to bully a species that should have been treated as equals. And they had nearly started a war that would have cost countless lives. It took almost 4 hours for the Council fleet to restore basic functionality to their ships. Engineers worked frantically to bring systems back online and repair the damage caused by the jump wake. When Admiral Cross finally regained communications with his flagship command staff, he found himself facing a situation he had never encountered before. His fleet was intact, but every captain was reporting the same thing. Their crews were shaken and morale was at an all-time low. They had been rendered completely helpless by a technology they did not understand and could not counter. Some of the younger officers were openly questioning whether they should even be confronting humanity at all. The Admiral sat in his command chair and considered his options. He could order another attack, but what would be the point? The human ship had already proven it could disable his entire fleet whenever it wanted. If the Defiant chose to follow up that demonstration with actual weapons fire, his ships would be destroyed before they could respond. For the first time in his career, Admiral Cross was forced to admit that he was outmatched. He opened a private channel to the Defiant and requested to speak with Captain Daniel Shaw. Daniel accepted the communication, and the two military commanders faced each other across the video link. Admiral Cross wasted no time on pleasantries. He asked Daniel a direct question. Could the Defiant have destroyed the Council fleet instead of just disabling it? Daniel considered lying or deflecting, but decided on honesty. Yes, he said simply. The jump wake they had used was set to minimum power purely as a demonstration. A full power wake combined with conventional weapons would have allowed them to destroy the entire fleet before any ship could mount a defense. And humanity had 47 ships equipped with jump drives. Admiral Cross absorbed this information in silence. Then he asked another question. Why had humanity shown restraint? Why disable the fleet instead of destroying it? Daniel's answer was straightforward. Because humanity did not want war. They wanted respect and fair treatment. The demonstration was meant to show the Council that threatening humanity was pointless. Not because humans were bloodthirsty, but because they were capable of defending themselves against any aggressor. The Admiral nodded slowly. He told Daniel that he would recommend to the Council that they reconsider their demands. Then he terminated the connection. As a warrior, he could respect strength, and the humans had certainly demonstrated that. But more importantly, they had shown wisdom by not using their full power. That combination of capability and restraint was rare and valuable. On Axis Prime, Ambassador Vincent Cole received an urgent message from Lieutenant Carl Jensen, the communications officer on the Defiant. Long-range sensors had detected new arrivals at the edge of the system. 3 human carriers and their escort groups had just jumped in. Fleet Captain Susan Wright was in command, and she had brought enough firepower to reinforce the Defiant or evacuate the human delegation if things went badly. The reinforcements held position at the system's edge, making no aggressive moves, but their presence sent a clear message. Humanity was prepared for any scenario. Vincent showed the message to Senator Maria Ortega, and she smiled grimly. She had requested those reinforcements before leaving Earth, but had not told anyone about them. Now the Council would understand that the Defiant was not alone. If they wanted a war, humanity was ready to give them one. But Maria hoped it would not come to that. Speaker Tharn called for an emergency council session to address what he called the crisis. The chamber was packed with representatives, and the atmosphere was tense. Some species were demanding immediate military escalation, while others were calling for diplomatic solutions. The council was deeply divided, and Tharn struggled to maintain order. Finally, he called for silence and recognized Counselor Vex, who had requested permission to speak. Vex was a reptilian being who had served on the council for over a century. He was known for his careful analysis and measured approach to problems. He began by acknowledging that the Council faced an unprecedented situation. Humanity had demonstrated technology that made them potentially the most powerful military force in the galaxy. The question was how to respond to this reality. Some Council members wanted to view humanity as a threat to be contained or destroyed. But Vex argued this was the wrong approach. Humanity had not attacked anyone. They had not seized territory belonging to other species. They had not made threats or demands. Instead, they had simply refused to disarm when ordered to do so. Was that really grounds for war? And even if the Council decided to fight, what would be the cost? How many Council ships would be destroyed? How many lives would be lost? And for what purpose? Vex proposed an alternative. Accept that humanity was a major power and treat them accordingly. Withdraw the demands for disarmament and negotiate a mutual security agreement instead. Work with humanity rather than against them. Learn from their technology and share Council knowledge in return. Build a partnership based on respect rather than trying to enforce dominance. Several Council members shouted objections, but Councilor Myra of the aquatic Delph species stood to support Vex. She pointed out that humanity had already contributed valuable medical and scientific advances to the Council. If they were treated as equals and partners, how much more could they offer? Fighting them would gain nothing, but working with them could benefit everyone. Before the debate could continue further, a new speaker requested recognition. Dr. Neil Carson was a human xenophysicist who had been studying jump drive technology since its development. He had been brought to the Council by Maria Ortega, specifically to explain the science behind what everyone had just witnessed. Speaker Tharn was hesitant to allow a human to address the Council, but Maria insisted it was necessary if they wanted to understand what they were dealing with. Dr. Carson was a thin, nervous man who looked uncomfortable standing before the entire Council assembly. But when he began to speak, his voice was clear and confident. He explained that the jump drive worked by creating controlled tiers in the fabric of space itself. These tiers allowed a ship to move from one location to another, without actually traveling the distance between them. The energy required was enormous, but human fusion technology had advanced to the point where it was practical. The jump wake was a side effect of creating these spatial tiers. When space was torn open, exotic energy flooded out in all directions. This energy interfered with conventional technology, causing the exact effects the Council fleet had experienced. Sensors overloaded and computers crashed and power systems fluctuated wildly. But Carson emphasized that what the Defiant had demonstrated was a minimal power wake, purely for demonstration purposes. A full power jump wake, he explained, could be weaponized on a massive scale. A single human warship using maximum power could create a wake large enough to disable hundreds of ships across an entire star system. And the effect was nearly instantaneous. There was no defense against it using current Council technology. Any fleet engaging human ships equipped with jump drives would be at a severe disadvantage. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Humanity had not just developed faster engines. They had developed a weapon system that made conventional naval warfare obsolete. Admiral Cross, who had been granted permission to observe the session, stood and confirmed Dr. Carson's explanation. His fleet had been completely helpless against the jump wake, and if the humans had followed up with conventional weapons, his ships would have been destroyed. Councillor Dreth rose to speak, and the chamber quieted out of respect for his age and experience. He admitted that he and the Council had made a terrible mistake. They had judged humanity by their youth rather than their capabilities. They had assumed that because humans were new to the galactic stage, they were weak and could be pushed around. This assumption had nearly led to a catastrophic war. Dreth proposed that the Council completely withdraw their demands and issue a formal apology to humanity. Furthermore, he suggested that the Council Charter be amended to prevent this kind of situation from happening again. All member species should be treated equally regardless of how long they had been part of the galactic community. Power and influence should be based on contributions and capabilities, not simply on seniority. Speaker Tharn looked shaken by everything that had happened. His authority had been challenged, and the Council he had led for so long was in turmoil. But he was experienced enough to recognize when a situation had gotten away from him. He called for a vote on Dreth's proposal, and to his surprise it passed with a large majority. The Council would withdraw their demands and begin negotiations with humanity as equals. Maria Ortega stood to address the council one final time. She accepted their decision and confirmed that humanity was willing to negotiate in good faith. They would work with the council on security concerns, and over time, they would share jump drive technology with trusted allies. But she made one thing absolutely clear. Humanity would never again submit to threats or unreasonable demands. The galaxy had changed, and everyone needed to accept that. The negotiations took 3 weeks, and they were difficult at times, but eventually a framework was agreed upon. Humanity would maintain their current military strength without restrictions. Human expansion would continue at whatever pace humans chose. In exchange, humanity would participate in joint council security operations and provide technological assistance to member species on a case-by-case basis. Most importantly, the council charter would be rewritten to ensure that all species were treated as equals regardless of their age or history. But before the final agreements could be signed, one more revelation shook the council. Commander Lisa Park was a human intelligence officer who had been quietly investigating the origins of the council's demands. She had been digging through diplomatic communications and financial records looking for the real reason why the council had suddenly decided humanity needed to be disarmed. What she found was disturbing. Maria Ortega presented Lisa's findings to the full council assembly, and the reaction was explosive. Several council species had been planning to seize human-colonized worlds once humanity was forced to disarm. These worlds were rich in rare minerals and other resources that the conspirators wanted for themselves. The demand for disarmament was not really about security concerns at all. It was the first step in what amounted to a plan for conquest and annexation. The evidence was clear and undeniable. Financial transfers between certain council members, secret communications discussing how to divide human territory, even preliminary military plans for occupation forces. The conspiracy involved 6 different species and dozens of high-ranking officials. It was a betrayal of everything the council claimed to stand for. Councillor Vex and Councillor Myra led the outcry demanding accountability. The conspirators were immediately suspended from the council, pending formal investigation. Several ambassadors resigned in disgrace while others were recalled to their homeworlds to face criminal charges. Speaker Tharn himself came under scrutiny for failing to notice or prevent the conspiracy. Within days, he announced his resignation, taking responsibility for the crisis. The scandal rocked the council to its core and forced a complete reevaluation of how the galactic government operated. For too long, power had been concentrated in the hands of a few elder species who made decisions without transparency or accountability. Newer species had been treated as junior members whose opinions did not really matter. This attitude had created an environment where corruption and conspiracy could flourish. President Richard Hayes addressed the council via quantum communication from Earth. He was accompanied by Admiral Jacob Price and other senior human officials. The president was direct in his assessment. The council had lost its way and forgotten its original purpose. It was supposed to be a forum for cooperation and mutual benefit. Instead, it had become a tool for the powerful to maintain their dominance over the weak. Hayes proposed a radical restructuring of the council. The position of permanent speaker would be eliminated and replaced with a rotating presidency that changed every 2 years. Each species would have equal voting power regardless of their history or economic strength. Decisions affecting military or economic matters would require a supermajority to prevent small groups from imposing their will on others. And most importantly, all council proceedings would be made public to ensure transparency and accountability. The proposals were met with resistance from some of the older species who stood to lose influence under the new system. But the majority of council members recognized that change was necessary. The old ways had nearly led to a devastating war. If the council was going to survive and remain relevant, it needed to evolve. The vote on the restructuring passed with 73% support. The council would rebuild itself from the ground up with new rules and new leadership. It would take time and there would be challenges along the way, but for the first time in millennia, the galactic government was truly attempting to create a fair and equal system. Captain Daniel Shaw received new orders from Admiral Lisa Grant. The Defiant would remain at Axis Prime as the permanent, human military presence. The ship would serve as both a reminder of what had happened and a symbol of the new relationship between humanity and the Council. Daniel was not entirely happy about the assignment, as it meant he would be spending more time in diplomatic meetings than military operations. But he understood the importance of the role. Lieutenant Kate Morrison was promoted to commander and given command of the new Defiant-class destroyer that was being built at Earth's orbital shipyards. She would lead the second generation of jump-drive-equipped ships into service. Before she left to take up her new command, she met with Daniel one last time on the observation deck of the Defiant. They looked out at the council station and the hundreds of ships from dozens of species moving through the space around it. Kate asked Daniel if he thought the peace would last or if humanity would eventually end up at war with the council anyway. Daniel considered the question carefully. He admitted he did not know for certain, but he believed they had a real chance at lasting peace. The council had learned a hard lesson about respecting others, and humanity had shown they could be powerful without being aggressive. Those were good foundations to build on, but Daniel also acknowledged that there would always be challenges and tensions. Different species had different values and different interests. Conflicts were inevitable. The key was managing those conflicts through diplomacy and negotiation rather than violence. And if violence ever did become necessary, humanity had proven they could defend themselves. Kate accepted that answer and left to begin her new assignment. Daniel remained on the observation deck for a long time, watching the traffic around the station. In the 3 weeks since the crisis began, everything had changed. Humanity had gone from being seen as weak newcomers to being recognized as a major galactic power, not through conquest or aggression, but by standing firm in the face of threats and demonstrating capabilities that could not be ignored. Ambassador Vincent Cole hosted a reception for the council members who had supported humanity during the crisis. Counselor Vex and Counselor Myra were both in attendance, along with several others who had called for diplomatic solutions rather than military action. Maria Ortega represented the human government, and she made a point of personally thanking each of them for their courage in standing up for what was right. Vincent reflected on how close they had come to disaster. If the Defiant had not been ready in time, or if the jump drive demonstration had failed, the outcome could have been very different. Humanity might have been forced into a war they did not want, or worse, they might have been pressured into accepting the Council's demands out of fear. But everything had worked out, and now humans had a real voice in galactic affairs. Across the galaxy, human colonies received the news that the crisis had been resolved peacefully. There was relief and celebration on dozens of worlds. People had been preparing for the possibility of war, and the tension had been high. Now they could return to their normal lives and continue building their new homes on distant planets. On Earth, Admiral Lisa Grant addressed the graduating class at the Space Force Academy. She told them about the events at Axis Prime and the role that Captain Daniel Shaw and the crew of the Defiant had played. But she emphasized that the real heroes were the engineers and scientists who had developed the jump drive and the diplomats who had negotiated a peaceful resolution. Military strength was important, but it was only one tool among many. The Admiral told the young officers that they were joining the Space Force at a pivotal moment in human history. Humanity was no longer an isolated species confined to one star system. They were part of a larger galactic community with all the opportunities and responsibilities that entailed. Their job would be to protect human interests and human lives while building relationships with alien species and working toward mutual understanding. It would not always be easy, the Admiral said. There would be species who did not like humans or did not trust them. There would be conflicts and crises and moments when war seemed inevitable. But if they approached every situation with both strength and wisdom, they could help ensure that humanity remained free and prosperous for generations to come. On the bridge of the Defiant, Daniel sat in his command chair and reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The Council was still recovering from the scandal, and the restructuring process was moving slowly. Some of the species who had lost influence under the new system were grumbling about unfair treatment. There were rumors of other conspiracies being investigated, and more resignations were expected. But there were also positive signs. Several Council species had approached humanity about technology exchange agreements. The Delph wanted to learn about human medical advances, while the Ven were interested in fusion reactor designs. Trade delegations were being organized and cultural exchange programs were being discussed. It seemed that once the fear and suspicion were stripped away, many species were genuinely interested. in working with humans. Lieutenant Jason Webb approached Daniel with a message from Earth. Fleet Captain Susan Wright and her carrier group were being reassigned to patrol the outer colonies. With the crisis at Axis Prime resolved there,